March 18, 1945, Hirchen Forest, 6 o'clock hours. The fog did not drift. It hung a solid weight pressing against the eyes, turning the forest into a cathedral of white silence. Sergeant Wilhelm Brenner felt it against his skin like wet wool, seeping through the collar of his greatcoat, finding the gaps in his gloves. He had stopped shivering 2 hours ago. That was dangerous. His father, a hunter in the Black Forest, had taught him that the moment you stop feeling the cold, you start dying. The panther emerged from nothing. Brenner saw the muzzle first. The long 75mm gun materialized like a finger pointing through the mist. Then the mantlet. Then the whitewashed turret with the tactical number 314 painted in black. The tank commander stood in his cupola, binoculars raised, his breath pluming in the frozen air. The engine note reached Brenner's ears, a half-second littoral low diesel growl that vibrated in his teeth. He was 26 meters away. He knew the distance because he had paced it yesterday, counting steps between the collapsed bunker and the oak tree that now hid him. 26 meters. Point-blank range for the Panther's machine guns. Suicide distance for infantry. The gun fired. The world became noise and pressure. Brenner felt the blast wave through the frozen earth, a punch that drove his diaphragm against his spine. The oak tree ceased to exist. One moment it was there, 2 meters thick, 80 years old. The next, it was splinters, a cloud of wooden shrapnel that rained down like thrown knives. Something hot cut his cheek. He did not move. Movement meant death. The tank commander was searching, binoculars sweeping left to right, waiting for the running man, the screaming man, the target that instinct said must follow such destruction. Brenner gave him nothing. The fog closed around the crater where the tree had stood. The tank held position, tracks grinding slightly as the driver adjusted, maintaining engine warmth. 8 seconds between shots. Brenner counted them. At 6, the breech closed with a metallic clang. At 8, the gun fired again, this time 30 meters to his right, where Feldrebel Kraus had established a machine gun position in a collapsed cellar. The explosion was different, muffled, absorbed by earth and timber. No return fire followed, no screams. Brenner had 9 men remaining from a platoon of 32. He knew their positions by memory. Dietrich in the drainage ditch. 17 years old, hands shaking so badly he had dropped his ammunition belt twice. Muller and the wounded Schrader behind the stone wall that had once been a farmhouse. Timur, he could not recall their names in the shell crater to his rear. Sharing a single rifle because one's bolt had frozen solid. The fog had reduced them to voices, to shadows, to the occasional cough that betrayed a position more surely than any flare. He assessed the terrain without rising. East lay the German lines, 400 meters uphill across open ground that the Panther dominated completely. North, the dry creek bed offered cover, but terminated in a minefield laid by their own engineers. South, the burning American half-track provided the only light in the white world, its diesel fire consuming itself with sullen efficiency. West was the tank. The temperature had dropped to -6 degrees. Brenner's left boot had filled with snowmelt that had frozen again, encasing his foot in ice. He flexed his fingers inside his gloves, feeling nothing past the second knuckle. Frostbite, the Hirchen Forest was worse than Russia. In Russia, the cold was honest. Here it came with fog and mud and trees that attracted shellfire like lightning rods. The Panther's engine note changed. Neutral, the commander was conserving fuel. Confident that the infantry before him was broken. Brenner heard voices from the turret. the relaxed cadence of men discussing rations, home, the absurdities of war. They spoke Swabian. He understood the dialect, caught fragments about a letter from Stuttgart, about the quality of the coffee substitute. He made his decision, not retreat. Retreat meant crossing 400 meters of observed ground, not surrender. The Americans had stopped taking prisoners in this sector. He would kill the tank. Not because he was brave, but because it was the only calculation that offered survival. He found Dietrich by touch, crawling through the frozen mud until his hand closed on the boy's shoulder. The 17-year-old flinched, then recognized the pressure pattern of Brenner's grip to short squeezes. Pause. One long. Brenner pulled the boy close, speaking directly into his ear, his breath steaming. He gave instructions that contradicted every tactical manual. Dietrich would run. Not away, but across the tank's front, firing, shouting, creating the impression of a larger force retreating in panic. The boy's eyes were too wide, but he nodded. He had stopped shaking. Brenner moved to Muller, then to the shell crater, passing the word in fragments and gestures. They would not fire unless discovered. They would not move unless signaled. They would wait, and in waiting, they would become part of the forest. The wounded Schrader insisted he could still load the MG for two. Brenner believed him. He positioned them to cover the northern approach. This was not defense. It was the arrangement of pieces for a single, desperate gambit. The Panther remained stationary, confident. Brenner retrieved the last serviceable Panzerfaust from the collapsed bunker. The weapon was cold, heavier than he remembered, the trigger guard packed with ice that he chipped away with his knife. The sight was calibrated for 50 meters. He would fire from 20. The backblast would cook his face. The flash would blind him. If he missed, the tank would kill him before the echo faded. He checked his watch, 634. The fog would persist another hour. He needed 10 minutes. He signaled to Dietrich. The boy rose from the drainage ditch with a sound that was not quite human. He ran through the trees, firing his rifle at shadows. The Panther's turret traversed immediately, the hydraulic whine cutting through the engine noise. The commander shouted, "Coordinates!" For 4 seconds, perhaps 5, the tank's full attention fixed on the running figure. Brenner broke cover at a sprint. 20 meters, 18. The Panzerfaust was an extension of his arms. He did not breathe. 16 meters. He could see the individual welds on the hull armor now, the rough texture of the Zimmerit paste. 14 meters. The tank commander turned. Their eyes met across the impossible distance. The man's mouth opened, a warning forming, his hand reaching for the cupola machine gun. Brenner saw the calculation in his eyes, the recognition that the battlefield had shifted. He saw the finger close on the trigger. The backblast struck him like a fist to the chest, a wall of superheated air that lifted him off his feet and threw him backward into the frozen mud. His vision went white, then red, then resolved into a blur of tears and smoke. He could not see. He could not hear. The world had become a ringing silence that pressed against his eardrums with physical force. He lay on his back, staring up at the fog, and waited for the machine gun that would finish him. It did not come. Instead, he felt heat. A wave of it washing over his face, drying the tears on his cheeks, turning the frozen crust beneath him to slush. He rolled onto his side, blinking furiously, and saw the Panther burning. The hollow charge warhead had struck precisely where he had aimed beneath the turret ring, where the armor was thinnest, where the ammunition storage waited in ready racks. The jet of molten copper had punched through the steel-like paper, igniting the propellant charges in a chain reaction that lifted the turret clear of the hull. It hung in the air for a moment, 60 tons of steel suspended impossibly, before crashing back down at an angle that trapped the crew inside their own coffin. Smoke poured from every opening, black and thick, and smelling of diesel and cooked meat. The ammunition began to cook off, individual rounds detonating like firecrackers, sending tracer fires spiraling into the fog in meaningless patterns. Brenner tried to stand. His legs would not obey him. He crawled instead, dragging himself away from the heat, his hands finding purchase on frozen earth that was already thawing in the fire's glow. He counted his fingers, his toes, cataloging injuries with the detached efficiency of a man who expected to need this information later. His face felt sunburned, tight, painful. The backblast. He would have scars. He would be blind in one eye, perhaps both. He did not know. He did not care. He was alive. The secondary explosion came as he reached the drainage ditch, a deep hump that compressed the air in his lungs and sent a fireball 30 meters into the fog. The Panther's fuel tanks had ignited. The heat was intense enough to melt the frozen branches overhead, sending showers of ice and water down upon him. He pressed his face into the mud, breathing through his fingers, and waited for the rain of debris to cease. When he looked up, Dietrich was standing over him. The boy's face was black with soot and cordite, his uniform torn, his rifle missing. But he was whole. He was alive. He extended a hand steady now, perfectly steady, and pulled Brenner to his feet. They stood together, leaning against each other for support, and watched the tank burn. The fog around it had cleared, driven back by the heat, creating a bubble of visibility in the white world. Through the flames, they could see the American lines now, the ridge line to the west, the shapes of men moving through the trees. The explosion had drawn attention. The battle was not over. It was merely entering a new phase. Brenner found his voice. It came as a rasp, his throat seared by the backblast, but it carried. He gave orders. Muller and Schrader would move to the creek bed, establishing a fallback position. The others would collect ammunition from the dead, redistributing what little remained. They would hold until dark, then withdraw under cover of darkness to the east. It was not a plan. It was a sequence of actions that might delay death long enough for night to intervene. The American mortar fire began at 0645. It was inaccurate. Ranging shots, searching for targets the observers could not clearly see. But it was close. Brenner pulled Dietrich into a shell crater as the first rounds walked toward them, the whistle-shriek crump of 81-meter shells punching through the fog. Dirt rained down on them, frozen clods that struck like stones. They pressed themselves into the earth, waiting for the barrage to lift, to shift, to find some other target. It did not shift. It intensified. Brenner understood then. The Americans had seen the fire, the smoke, the burning tank. They knew a German position had revealed itself. They were not going to wait for infantry. They were going to plaster the coordinates until nothing remained alive. The shells came faster now, a drumbeat of destruction that turned the frozen forest into a landscape of flying steel and splintered wood. A tree burst overhead, the shell detonating in the branches and sending wooden shrapnel screaming downward. Something struck Brenner's helmet, a glancing blow that filled his vision with sparks. He kept his head down. He kept breathing. The wounded Schrader died in the barrage. They found him afterward, still clutching the MG-42, his chest opened by a splinter that had penetrated between the plates of his flak vest. Muller was wounded in the leg, the artery severed. bleeding out into the snow until Dietrich applied a tourniquet with the practiced efficiency of a boy who had learned too much too quickly. They were, for now, Brenner, Dietrich, Muller, and a private named Hoffmann, whose name Brenner had finally remembered. 4 men, 2 rifles, a single Panzerfaust with a cracked sight, and 400 meters of killing ground between them and safety. The fog began to lift at 0730, not dissipating, but thinning. Visibility extending to 50 meters, then 80, then 100. They could see the American positions clearly now, the sandbagged emplacements on the ridge, the movement of vehicles behind the tree line. They could see the second tank, a Sherman with waiting stacks still attached, working its way along the creek bed to flank them. They could see their own death approaching with the patience of machinery. Brenner made his second decision of the morning. They would not wait for dark. They would move now, in the mist's last protection, using the burning Panther as cover. They would crawl, then walk, then run, and they would not stop until they reached the German lines or died in the attempt. He gave the order without explanation. Explanation took time they did not have. He simply began to move, crawling through the mud and ash, and the others followed. They covered the first 100 meters without drawing fire. The burning tank provided a heat signature that confused thermal observation, a smokescreen that drifted eastward with the faint breeze. Brenner moved on his elbows and knees, the Panzerfaust dragging behind him, his burned face pressed to the earth. He counted his progress in tree trunks. 1, 2, 5, 10. The ridgeline seemed no closer. The fog was thinning faster now, visibility reaching 200 meters, then 250. Soon they would be seen. Soon the machine guns would open up. At 300 meters, Muller's tourniquet failed. They heard him fall, a soft cry cut short, and turned to find him pale and shaking, blood pumping from his thigh with each heartbeat. Dietrich reached for him, but Brenner stopped the boy with a hand on his shoulder. They could not carry him. They could not stop, Muller understood. He waved them on, his hand finding his pistol, his eyes meeting Brenner's with something that might have been gratitude or might have been accusation. They left him there, propped against a tree, and did not look back. The machine gun fire started at 350 meters. 'Twas a Browning .30 caliber, the distinctive thump-thump-thump of American automatic weapons. Tracer rounds cutting through the fog in red lines that seemed to move slowly until they cracked past Brenner's ear. He ran. He had not run since basic training, not truly run, but now his legs found some reserve of strength, some final payment on a debt his body had been keeping. Dietrich ran beside him, then ahead of him, the boy's youth asserting itself in the desperate sprint for life. Hoffmann fell behind, then fell entirely, a burst catching him in the back and driving him face first into the frozen earth. 200 meters. 150. The German lines were visible now. The familiar shape of trench works and wire, the muzzle flashes of covering fire as someone with authority recognized their uniforms and ordered. Suppression of the American positions. Brenner could see individual faces, men shouting encouragement, waving them forward. He could see the medical station, the stretcher bearers preparing to move. He was 10 meters from the trench line when the mortar round found him. It was not a direct hit. Such precision would have been merciful. Instead, it struck the earth beside him, the blast lifting him and throwing him into the trench with a violence that broke his left arm and 3 ribs and drove the air from his lungs in a single explosive gasp. He lay at the bottom of the trench, staring up at the gray sky, and felt nothing. The pain would come later. For now, There was only the profound relief of stillness, of safety, of walls between himself and the killing ground. Hands found him. Voices spoke words he could not process. He was lifted, carried, lowered onto a stretcher that smelled of blood and iodine. He turned his head and saw Dietrich walking beside him, whole, alive, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on his cheeks. The boy was saying something, repeating it, a mantra or a prayer, or simply the release of terror into words. Brenner could not hear him. His ears were still ringing from the panther's destruction, from the mortar blast, from the accumulated violence of the morning. They operated on him in a field hospital carved into the reverse slope of the ridge, a cellar reinforced with timber and sandbags that smelled of ether and gangrene. He woke once, briefly, to find a surgeon removing splinters from his face with tweezers. The man's concentration absolute, his hands steady. He woke again in a train car, the rhythm of the tracks matching the throb of his injuries, bound for a hospital in the Rhineland. He did not wake again until April, by which time the war had moved eastward without him, leaving him in a clean bed with a view of mountains he did not recognize. The citation arrived in May, after the surrender. Iron Cross, First Class, for the destruction of an enemy tank and the preservation of a vital position. There was no mention of Dietrich, of Muller, of the 9, who had become 4, who had become 2. There was no mention of the fog or the cold, or the moment when a man's eyes had met his across 4 meters of frozen air and recognized the geometry of death. Brenner folded the certificate and placed it in a drawer and did not speak of that morning for 40 years. He met Dietrich once more in 1987 at a reunion in Munich. The boy was a man of 60, a baker again, with grandchildren and a tremor in his hands that he attributed to age, but that Brenner recognized as the legacy of that morning in March. They sat in a beer garden and watched the sunset, and they spoke of everything except the war, of their families, of their work, of the remarkable fact of their survival. When they parted, they embraced, and Brenner felt the boy's heart beat against his own, the same rhythm they had shared in a shell crater while the world burned around them. Brenner died in 2003 in the same village where he had been born. Among his effects, his daughter found a photograph, creased and faded, showing a young man in uniform standing beside a burning tank. On the back, in his father's careful script, she read, March 18, 1945, -6 degrees. We were alive.